February 19th, 2026, 4:17 local time, the Arabian Sea. 3 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers are operating within 200 nautical miles of each other. USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, USS Harry S. Truman, USS Carl Vinson. Combined displacement, over 300,000 tons. Combined air wings, 210 aircraft. Combined crew, nearly 18,000 sailors. The last time 3 American carrier strike groups operated in the same theater was March 2003, the opening of Operation Iraqi Freedom. This is not a drill. This is not an exercise. And within 72 hours, every single one of those carriers will be rendered strategically irrelevant, not by a missile, not by a torpedo, not by a mine, but by an insurance underwriter sitting in an office on Lime Street in London. I'm your host at Navy Battlefront, where we break down the most critical naval operations shaping global power. Today, we're reconstructing the most expensive military miscalculation of 2026, a moment when the United States deployed $45 billion in naval hardware to solve a problem that couldn't be solved with firepower, and how Iran found the one domain where carrier-based air power meant absolutely nothing. To understand how 3 carrier strike groups ended up concentrated in the most dangerous choke point on Earth, you have to go back 4 months. October 2025, the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, 2 shipping lanes, each 2 miles across, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. Every day, roughly 17 million barrels of crude oil transit through this corridor. That's approximately 20% of global petroleum consumption passing through a waterway, narrower than the English Channel. Iran controls the entire northern shore. Its coastline runs along the strait for over 100 miles. The islands of Qeshm, Hormuz, and Larak sit directly in the shipping lanes. And on those islands, buried in hardened shelters and mobile launchers, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy maintains what Western intelligence calls the most dense anti-ship missile network on the planet. On October 3, 2025, IRGC fast attack craft began conducting what Tehran described as naval sovereignty exercises inside the strait. Dozens of small boats, armed with Chinese-made C-802 anti-ship missiles, began shadowing commercial tankers. They didn't fire. They didn't board. They simply followed, at distances of 200 to 500 meters, for hours at a time. The international shipping community noticed immediately, but the Pentagon initially classified the activity as routine harassment. CENTCOM's weekly intelligence summary from October 8th described it as provocative, but non-escalatory. That assessment was wrong, because what the intelligence analysts missed, what they wouldn't piece together for another 6 weeks, was that the fast boat patrols were not the operation. They were the distraction. While every American surveillance asset in the Gulf focused on tracking small boats on the surface, something far more consequential was happening underground. IRGC cyber units, operating from facilities in Isfahan and Shiraz, had begun probing the Automatic Identification System, AIS, the global tracking network that monitors the position of every commercial vessel on Earth. AIS transponders broadcast a ship's identity, position, speed, and heading. Every port authority, every coast guard, every maritime insurance company depends on this data to function. The Iranians weren't trying to hack the system. Not yet. They were mapping it, learning its architecture, identifying the 12 critical relay nodes that processed AIS data for the entire Persian Gulf region. This would matter enormously later, but in October, no one was looking. By November 2025, the situation in the strait had deteriorated sharply. IRGC forces had shifted from shadowing to active interference. On November 12th, Revolutionary Guard fast boats surrounded the Maltese-flagged tanker Aegean Voyager. and forced it to divert to Bandar Abbas for what Iran called a routine inspection. The ship was held for 9 days. On November 19th, the same thing happened to a Greek-flagged chemical tanker. On November 26th, a Panamanian bulk carrier. 3 seizures in 2 weeks. The pattern was unmistakable. Oil prices, which had been hovering around $94 per barrel since the summer, surged past $110 by the end of November. Shipping insurance premiums for Gulf transit doubled overnight. The Pentagon responded with what it knew best: presence. USS Eisenhower, already deployed to the 5th Fleet Area of Responsibility, was ordered to increase combat air patrols over the strait. E-2D Advanced Hawkeye radar planes flew continuous orbits, tracking every vessel and aircraft within 300 miles. FA-18E Super Hornets maintained a constant Ready 5 posture on the flight deck, 5 minutes from engine start to catapult launch. It was an impressive display, and it accomplished almost nothing, because Iran wasn't trying to close the strait militarily. It was closing it economically. Every tanker seizure, every harassment incident, every close approach by an armed fast boat, each one generated a claim on a marine insurance policy. Each claim increased the actuarial risk assessment. Each risk assessment drove premiums higher, and higher premiums meant fewer ships willing to make the transit. By December 15th, 2025, daily oil traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had declined by 22%. Not because Iran had blockaded anything, because shipping companies had voluntarily rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days to the journey from the Gulf to Europe, rather than pay the insurance premiums. Oil hit $128 per barrel on December 20th. The White House convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Council on December 22nd. According to sources familiar with the discussion, Secretary of Defense Mitchell argued for a direct confrontation, escorting commercial vessels through the strait with U.S. Navy warships, daring Iran to interfere with a protected convoy. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Thomas Ridgway, pushed back. Escorting individual tankers would require dedicating every available destroyer and cruiser in the theater to convoy duty, stripping the carrier strike groups of their defensive screens. The compromise was a third option: surge overwhelming force into the region. Make the cost of Iranian interference so obviously catastrophic that Tehran would have no choice but to back down. The order went out on January 4th, 2026. USS Harry S. Truman, operating in the Mediterranean, was redirected through the Suez Canal. USS Carl Vinson, halfway through a Western Pacific deployment near Guam, was ordered west at maximum speed. Together with USS Eisenhower already on station, this would create the most concentrated display of American naval power since the opening of the Iraq War. The transit alone was a logistical achievement. The Truman Battle Group, 1 carrier, 2 guided missile cruisers, 4 destroyers, 1 fast combat support ship, cleared the Suez Canal on January 11th and entered the Red Sea. The Vinson Group departed the Philippine Sea on January 8th and crossed the Indian Ocean in 11 days, averaging 28 knots. By February 1st, 2026, all 3 carrier strike groups were operating in the Arabian Sea, south of the Strait of Hormuz. Combined order of battle: 3 Nimitz-class carriers, 6 Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers armed with 122 Tomahawk cruise missiles each, 12 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers carrying a mix of SM-2, SM-6, and evolved Sea Sparrow surface-to-air missiles. Each carrier air wing consisted of 4 strike fighter squadrons of F/A, 18E/F Super Hornets, 1 electronic warfare squadron of EA-18G Growlers, 1 airborne early warning squadron of E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes, and 2 helicopter squadrons. Total combat aircraft: 210. Total vertical launch cells across the surface fleet: over 1,500. The combined firepower exceeded the entire military capability of most nations on Earth. CENTCOM issued a public statement on February 3rd. The United States maintains the right to ensure freedom of navigation in international waterways. These deployments demonstrate our commitment to that principle. Tehran's public response was predictable. Supreme Leader Khamenei called the deployment the desperate convulsions of a dying empire. IRGC Commander General Hossein Salami promised that the Persian Gulf would become a graveyard for American ships. Standard rhetoric, expected posturing. But inside the IRGC's Strategic Operations Center in Tehran, something very different was happening. According to after-action assessments compiled by CENTCOM Intelligence, IRGC Quds Force Commander Brigadier General Esmail Khani convened a meeting of senior commanders on February 4th, the day after the American announcement. The meeting lasted 11 hours. The conclusion, reconstructed from intercepted communications and human intelligence reporting, was a single directive: do not engage the carriers. Engage everything around them. This was the moment the entire crisis pivoted, and almost no one in Washington understood it until it was too late. The IRGC's plan had 3 components. Each one targeted a different domain. None of them required firing a single shot at a U.S. warship. Component 1, the logistics chain. The United States military in the Middle East depends on a sprawling network of forward operating bases, ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, and communications nodes spread across Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Every round of ammunition, every gallon of jet fuel, every spare part for an FA-18 engine flows through this network before it reaches the fleet. On February 7, 2026, at 2:30 local time, Iranian-aligned militia groups in Iraq launched simultaneous attacks on 3 separate targets. Al-Assad Air Base in Anbar Province was struck by a salvo of 14 one-way attack drones. Iranian-designed Shahed 136 variants, launched from positions 40 kilometers to the northeast. The drones approached at low altitude, below 300 feet, exploiting gaps in the base's CRAM counter-rocket artillery and mortar defense system. 9 of the 14 drones were intercepted. 5 got through. 2 struck the fuel storage area, igniting 200,000 gallons of JP-8 jet fuel. The fire burned for 19 hours. Simultaneously, a convoy of U.S. Army logistics vehicles en route Tampa south of Baghdad was ambushed with a combination of roadside explosives and RPG fire. 3 trucks carrying Patriot missile battery components were destroyed. No American soldiers were killed. The convoy had armored escorts, but the equipment losses were significant. Replacing those components would take weeks. The third attack targeted the port facility at Qasr in southern Iraq, where U.S. Navy logistics ships offloaded supplies for transfer to the fleet. A small boat packed with explosives detonated against the port's primary loading crane, rendering one of 2 berths inoperable. 3 attacks, 3 different locations, all within a 47-minute window. The coordination was precise, but this was only Component 1, and it wasn't even the most damaging. Component 2 began 12 hours later. The cyber operation. At 14:22, Gulf Standard Time on February 7th, the Automatic Identification System relay node serving the port of Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates went offline. Fujairah is the largest bunkering port in the world, the place where commercial vessels refuel before or after transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Without AIS data, port authorities couldn't track incoming vessels. Ships couldn't confirm the identity or trajectory of other ships in congested waters. The port suspended all inbound traffic within 30 minutes. At 14:38, the AIS relay serving Dubai's Jebel Ali port, the largest commercial port in the Middle East, experienced what investigators later described as data corruption at the protocol level. Ship positions displayed on monitoring screens began jumping erratically. A 300-meter container ship appeared to be located in the middle of downtown Dubai, A tanker that had departed 2 hours earlier showed as still docked. The system became worse than useless. It became actively misleading. Bahrain's Khalifa bin Salman port went dark at 1451. Muscat's port, Sultan Qaboos, at 1503. Doha's Hamad port at 1517. Within 1 hour, AIS coverage across the entire Persian Gulf had either been disabled or corrupted. Commercial shipping ground to a halt, not because the ships couldn't sail, but because no one could tell where anything was. CENTCOM initially treated the cyberattacks as a secondary concern. The carrier strike groups maintained their own military tracking systems. SPY-1D radar on the Aegis cruisers and destroyers, E-2D radar from airborne platforms. The fleet could still see everything within 400 miles, but the fleet wasn't the target. Commerce was. The question that no one at CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa had adequately war-gamed was this: what happens when the world's most important oil transit choke point becomes digitally blind? The answer came from London at 9:14 Greenwich Mean Time on February 8th. Lloyd's of London, the insurance market that underwrites approximately 70% of global maritime risk, issued a Joint War Committee advisory reclassifying the entire Persian Gulf as a listed area. This designation, which hadn't been applied to the Gulf since the tanker war of the 1980s, meant that any commercial vessel entering the area would face insurance premiums so high that transit became economically non-viable for most cargoes. Standard war risk premiums had already been elevated. The new classification pushed them to between 5 and 10% of hull value per voyage. For a modern VLCC, very large crude carrier, valued at $120 million, that meant paying $6 to $12 million in additional insurance for a single trip through the strait. No tanker company on Earth could absorb that cost. Within 24 hours of the Lloyd's advisory, every major oil company with tankers in the Gulf issued hold orders. Vessels already loaded at Saudi or Kuwaiti terminals anchored in place rather than attempting the strait. Vessels en route to the Gulf from Asia and Europe diverted to alternative loading points. Oil prices breached $150 per barrel on February 9th. 3 carrier strike groups, 210 combat aircraft, 1,500 vertical launch cells loaded with missiles that cost between $1 million and $4 million each. Not a single one of them could compel a British insurance underwriter to change a risk classification. Comment asymmetric if you see the strategic problem here. Component 3 was the quietest and in many ways the most sophisticated of Iran's responses. The Quds Force Sleeper Network activation. According to declassified summaries from a joint CIA-NSA investigation completed in early March 2026, IRGC Quds Force operatives had spent years cultivating access to commercial maritime services companies across the Gulf states. Not military targets, commercial ones, ship management firms, classification societies, vessel tracking software providers, port logistics coordinators. Beginning on February 8th, timed to coincide with the Lloyd's advisory, these networks activated. In Dubai, an employee at a major ship management company with access to scheduling systems for over 400 commercial vessels introduced malware that scrambled departure and arrival manifests across the company's fleet. The malware wasn't destructive. It was designed to create confusion. Ships showed as departing when they hadn't. Cargo manifests were subtly altered. Fuel orders were duplicated or canceled. In Muscat, a similar operation targeted a maritime communications provider that handled satellite uplink services for vessels transiting the Arabian Sea. The disruption wasn't total. It was intermittent, just enough to make satellite communications unreliable, just enough to make masters and crews nervous. In Bahrain, a cyber intrusion compromised the internal network of a firm that provided hull and machinery survey services for insurance compliance. Without valid survey certificates, insurers could deny coverage entirely. The firm was forced to suspend all certifications pending a security audit that took 9 days to complete. None of these operations involved explosives. None involved weapons. None targeted military personnel or assets. And collectively, they did more damage to American strategic objectives than a volley of anti-ship missiles ever could. Aboard USS Eisenhower, Rear Admiral Catherine Vasquez, commander of Carrier Strike Group 2 and the senior naval officer in theater, faced a problem that no amount of carrier aviation could solve. Her air wing was flying round-the-clock patrols. Her Aegis escorts were tracking every Iranian military asset within radar range. Her intelligence team could identify every IRGC fast boat, every coastal missile battery, every submarine contact in the operational area, and none of it mattered. The encrypted communication intercepted on February 8th at 21:37, a burst transmission from an IRGC signals unit on Chesham Island, had been flagged by the Eisenhower's cryptologic warfare team as high priority. It took NSA analysts at Fort Meade 36 hours to partially decrypt the message. What they found confirmed what Vasquez already suspected. The IRGC had no intention of engaging the carrier strike groups directly. The message referenced ongoing operations across 6 domains, a term that Iranian military doctrine uses to describe simultaneous action across land, sea, air, cyber, space, and information environments. 6 domains. The carriers dominated exactly 2 of them. On February 10th, Vasquez convened a classified video teleconference with Vice Admiral James Harmon, commander of 5th Fleet, at the naval support activity in Bahrain. According to sources familiar with the exchange, Vasquez was direct. The carrier strike groups were consuming enormous quantities of resources, fuel, flight hours, maintenance capacity, while achieving no measurable effect on the crisis. Every day, the carriers operated at a high tempo cost, approximately $7 million per strike group in fuel and consumables alone. That was $21 million per day for 3 groups, and the Iranians knew it. Vasquez recommended repositioning at least 1 carrier strike group to the Gulf of Oman, farther from the strait, to reduce the concentration of assets in a confined area while maintaining strike capability. Harmon forwarded the recommendation to CENTCOM. CENTCOM forwarded it to the Pentagon. The Pentagon denied the request. According to defense officials who spoke on background, the decision to keep all 3 carriers concentrated near the strait was driven primarily by optics, not tactics. Withdrawing a carrier, even repositioning one to a more defensible location 300 miles to the east, would be interpreted as a retreat. The White House had publicly committed to keeping the carriers in place until Iran ceased its interference with commercial shipping. Pulling one back would undermine the entire messaging strategy. Vasquez's assessment was overruled by a calculation that had nothing to do with naval warfare. Meanwhile, the economic damage was accelerating. Oil at $150 per barrel cascaded through the global economy. Airlines announced emergency fuel surcharges. Trucking companies in Europe and Asia raised rates by 30% overnight. Chemical manufacturers dependent on Gulf-sourced petroleum feedstocks began idling production lines. The S&P 500 dropped 8% in 5 trading days. And on February 12th, Iran played its final card. At 6 a.m. local time, IRGC Commander General Salami held a press conference in Tehran. He announced that Iran was offering to guarantee the safety of commercial shipping in the Persian Gulf, provided that all foreign military vessels withdrew to a distance of at least 100 nautical miles from Iranian territorial waters. He framed it not as a demand, but as a solution. Iran would ensure freedom of navigation, he said, if America stopped threatening it with aircraft carriers. The offer was, from a military standpoint, absurd. Iran was the source of the threat to commercial shipping. Asking the U.S. Navy to withdraw while Iran promised to behave was like asking the police to leave the neighborhood so the burglar could guarantee security. But the offer wasn't aimed at the Pentagon. It was aimed at the shipping companies, at the insurance underwriters, at the oil traders, at every commercial entity that wanted the crisis to end and didn't care about strategic principles. Within hours, 3 major Asian oil importers, Japan, South Korea, and India, issued statements calling for all parties to demonstrate restraint and explore diplomatic solutions. They didn't endorse Iran's proposal explicitly. They didn't need to. The message was clear. They wanted the carriers gone if that's what it took to get oil flowing again. February 14th, Valentine's Day. There was no romance in the Arabian Sea. Rear Admiral Vasquez received intelligence that changed her tactical calculus entirely. AP-8, a Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operating south of the strait, detected what analysts classified as an Iranian Fateh-class submarine at a depth of approximately 70 meters, 40 nautical miles southeast of the carrier formation. The Fateh class is a domestically produced diesel-electric submarine, small, quiet, and armed with both torpedoes and anti-ship cruise missiles. A single submarine wasn't a serious threat to 3 carrier strike groups with 12 escorts. But the detection raised an urgent question. How long had it been there? The P-8A's sonobuoy field had been active for only 6 hours. The submarine could have been trailing the formation for days. Worse, if one Fateh class was there, others might be too. Iran operates at least 3 Fateh-class boats and at least 1 Kilo class, a Russian-designed submarine significantly quieter than anything Iran had built domestically. Vasquez ordered an immediate anti-submarine warfare sweep. 4 MH-60R Seahawk helicopters from the Eisenhower's destroyer escorts deployed dipping sonar across a 50-mile radius. 2 additional P-8As were diverted from patrol routes to seed sonobuoy barriers east and west of the formation. The sweep took 11 hours. It found 2 more contacts. One was confirmed as a second Fateh-class submarine. The other was classified as a probable, but not confirmed, Kilo-class boat operating at ultra-quiet speed, barely making 2 knots at a depth of 90 meters. 3 submarines, possibly operating in a coordinated picket around the carrier formation, not attacking, not approaching, just watching, just proving they could be there. This was the IRGC's message. We don't need to sink your carriers. We just need you to know we could try. Subscribe if you want to understand how asymmetric warfare is changing the balance of power at sea. The operational situation by mid-February was, in the clinical language of military planning, untenable. The carriers were burning through fuel, flight hours, and crew endurance at a rate designed for short-term surges, not extended standoffs. The Eisenhower had been deployed for over 8 months, well beyond the standard 7-month rotation. Crew fatigue was becoming a factor. Maintenance backlogs on the air wing were growing. 2 FA-18E Super Hornets had been grounded with engine issues that couldn't be fully repaired without shipyard facilities. The logistics chain through Iraq was degraded, but functional. The militia attacks had caused damage, but U.S. forces had adapted, rerouting supplies through alternate corridors. The cyber damage, however, was proving far harder to remediate. AIS systems across the Gulf were restored to partial functionality by February 16th, but commercial confidence had been shattered. Shipping companies demanded independent verification that the systems were secure before resuming operations. That verification process would take weeks, and the insurance market showed no signs of relenting. Lloyd's maintained its listed area designation. Premiums stayed astronomical. The economic blockade of the Gulf, imposed not by Iranian mines or missiles, but by actuarial tables and risk assessments, remained firmly in place. On February 17th, CENTCOM Commander General David Brennan flew to Bahrain for a face-to-face meeting with Fifth Fleet leadership and Rear Admiral Vasquez, who came ashore via helicopter from the Eisenhower. The meeting lasted 4 hours. What emerged, according to defense officials briefed on the discussions, was an acknowledgement that the three-carrier deployment had failed to achieve its primary objective. Iran had not been deterred. Commercial shipping had not resumed. Oil prices had not stabilized, and the extended deployment was creating maintenance and readiness problems that would affect fleet operations for months after the carriers returned home. Brennan authorized what the Navy calls a phased repositioning. The Carl Vinson strike group, the last to arrive and the freshest in terms of crew and equipment, would remain on station south of the strait. The Truman group would reposition to the Gulf of Oman, approximately 300 nautical miles east, maintaining strike capability while reducing the concentrated target profile. The Eisenhower, after nearly 9 months deployed, would begin its transit home. The announcement was carefully worded. The Pentagon described it as an optimization of force posture consistent with ongoing operational requirements. No one used the word withdrawal, but everyone understood what it meant. The error, the fundamental miscalculation, wasn't tactical. It was conceptual. The Pentagon had deployed carrier strike groups to solve a military problem. Iran had created an economic problem. The carriers were optimized for destroying targets. Iran's strategy was designed to make destruction irrelevant. You can't shoot an insurance premium. You can't bomb a risk assessment. You can't launch a Tomahawk cruise missile at a Lloyd's of London advisory committee. The IRGC spent an estimated $40 to $60 million on the entire operation. The drone attacks, the cyber campaign, the sleeper network activations. The United States spent over $500 million on the three-carrier surge in fuel, munitions, equipment wear, and accelerated maintenance alone. The cost ratio was roughly 10 to 1 in Iran's favor. And that didn't account for the economic damage. The spike in oil prices cost the global economy an estimated $800 billion in the 4 weeks between the Lloyd's advisory and the partial resumption of Gulf shipping in early March. Iran found the seam, the gap between military dominance and strategic effectiveness, the space where $45 billion in warships become expensive, floating, irrelevant monuments to a doctrine designed for a different kind of war. The consequences of the February crisis extended far beyond the Persian Gulf. In Congress, the Senate Armed Services Committee announced hearings on what Chairman Senator Roland Hayes called the carrier doctrine gap, the growing disparity between the cost of maintaining carrier strike groups and their effectiveness against adversaries who refuse to present targetable military forces. The hearings, still ongoing as of this recording, have featured testimony from retired admirals, defense analysts, and insurance industry executives. The central question is uncomfortable. If the primary threat to freedom of navigation isn't military, if it's economic, cyber, and informational, does the United States need 12 aircraft carriers? Allied relationships suffered. The UAE and Bahrain, which host critical U.S. military facilities, were furious that the American military response had failed to protect their commercial port infrastructure from Iranian cyberattacks. Emirati officials made their displeasure known through diplomatic channels, and press reports indicated that Abu Dhabi had opened a quiet back channel to Tehran, without informing Washington, to explore bilateral security arrangements for Gulf shipping. The intelligence community launched a comprehensive review of how the IRGC's multi-domain strategy had evaded detection. The cyber operations, in retrospect, had left signatures that should have been caught months earlier. The AIS system probing in October had been logged by cybersecurity firms monitoring Gulf infrastructure, but the reports had been routed to the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, not to CENTCOM. The militia attack preparations in Iraq had been partially detected by overhead imagery, but the imagery analysts had flagged them as routine weapons movements. not pre-positioned assault stocks. The Quds Force sleeper network activations had triggered no alerts at all. 4 different domains, 4 different intelligence collection systems, none of them talking to each other in real time. The fragmentation of intelligence that had been identified as a critical vulnerability after September 11th had, 25 years later, produced exactly the kind of failure it was supposed to prevent. Oil prices gradually declined through late February and early March as diplomatic negotiations, brokered by Oman and Qatar, produced a fragile de-escalation framework. By March 10, 2026, Gulf shipping had resumed at approximately 70% of pre-crisis volume. Insurance premiums remained elevated but were slowly declining. AIS systems had been restored, audited, and, in several cases, completely rebuilt with enhanced security protocols. The Eisenhower arrived at Norfolk Naval Station on March 2nd, completing a deployment of 9 months and 11 days, one of the longest carrier deployments in modern Navy history. Crew members who had expected to be home before Christmas didn't see their families until spring. The Carl Vinson remains on station in the Arabian Sea. The Truman operates from the Gulf of Oman. Both continue to fly patrols and maintain readiness. But readiness for what? That's the question that no one in Washington has answered satisfactorily. The February crisis demonstrated that the most powerful naval force in history can be strategically neutralized by an adversary willing to fight in domains where naval power doesn't apply. Iran didn't need to match American carrier aviation. It needed to make the carriers irrelevant, and it succeeded. The Fateh-class submarines detected near the carrier formation were never engaged. They withdrew after the Eisenhower departed, slipping back into Iranian waters through the strait. The encrypted transmission intercepted on February 8th was eventually fully decrypted. Its contents were classified, but officials described it as an operational coordination message confirming that the IRGC intended to avoid any direct military confrontation with U.S. forces. The entire point was to demonstrate that confrontation was unnecessary. An aircraft carrier is the most impressive military instrument ever created. 100,000 tons of sovereign territory, nuclear-powered, capable of projecting lethal force across hundreds of miles. A single carrier strike group carries more firepower than most countries possess in their entire arsenals. And in February 2026, 3 of them couldn't keep an oil tanker insured. The Persian Gulf crisis isn't over. The underlying tensions, Iran's regional ambitions, America's commitment to freedom of navigation, the world's dependence on Gulf oil, haven't been resolved. They've been deferred. The fragile de-escalation holds for now. But the IRGC has demonstrated a template, a playbook for defeating a superpower without ever engaging its military directly. That playbook is now being studied in Beijing, in Moscow, in Pyongyang, in every capital where military planners look at American carrier strike groups and ask, how do we neutralize that? Iran just showed them how. The question isn't whether this playbook will be used again. It's where, and whether the most powerful navy in the world will have an answer when it is. Some weapons are